You were chosen because no respectable lady would accept such a ridiculous arrangement. Lady Euphemia Corisande spoke those words beneath the golden chandeliers of Ashcombe Hall, where every candle seemed to burn brighter for the amusement of the guests gathered around the coriander tutu. Ballroom. Her voice carried across the polished floor, past the silk gowns and black coats, past the silver trays and the musicians who had lowered their instruments to listen. At the center of the room stood Miss Aurelia Vane, a young woman whose hands had gone still at her sides. The laughter came first. Soft laughter from the corners of the room. A few cruel smiles from gentlemen who had never met her before that evening. A group of young ladies whispered behind their fans, pretending not to stare while making certain Aurelia could hear every word. Lady Euphemia lifted the invitation card between two fingers, as though it was something unpleasant. Aurelia had been brought to Ashcombe Hall, believing she was attending a formal dinner to discuss an unexpected proposal. Instead, she discovered that the entire gathering had been arranged as a spectacle, a joke. A wealthy duke needed a wife before the end of the season. His relatives wanted to avoid scandal. His name required a respectable marriage, but the ladies of London had already refused him, each for her own reasons. So Lady Euphemia had searched for someone she believed no one would defend, a quiet daughter of a forgotten family, a woman without a fortune, a woman who could be mocked without consequence. And now, before the highest circles of society, Aurelia Vane had been offered as a bride no one expected to become a duchess. The room fell silent when the Duke of Ashcombe entered. No one laughed then, because everyone knew the Duke had heard the insult. Yet the strangest thing was not his anger. It was the way he walked directly toward Aurelia, took her hand before the entire assembly, and answered with a calmness that made even the cruelest voices disappear. He did not say she was a mistake. He did not say she was a charity case. He said that if Miss Aurelia Vane had been chosen as a bride, then she would be treated as one. And no one in that room understood that the woman they had mocked was carrying a truth that could shake Ashcombe Hall itself. If you are listening from wherever you are in the world, share where you are hearing this story from today. If you enjoy tales of hidden secrets, lost dignity, and justice among the old aristocracy, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you do not miss the next chapter. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these stories to life. And now let us return to the beginning of Aurelia Vane's journey. 3 years before that evening, Aurelia had never imagined that her name would be spoken in a ballroom filled with noble families. She had lived quietly at a smaller estate on the edge of the countryside, where the roof leaked during winter storms, and the old servants knew every sound the says from Alaravan Dodot, to the says, wooden floors made beneath their feet. Her father, Mr. Edmund Vane, had once owned a comfortable property and a modest fortune. He was not a lord, not an earl, not a man whose arrival caused servants to rush forward, but he had been respected. He had believed a person's worth was found in their conduct rather than their title. Aurelia had learned from him how to keep careful accounts, how to manage a household, how to read letters from merchants, and how to understand the value of things that appeared insignificant: a warm loaf of bread, a repaired coat, a candle saved for another evening. She had also learned that kindness could disappear quickly when money became involved. After her father's death, the Vane estate was no longer a place of comfort. It became a place of negotiation. Relatives arrived carrying polite smiles and hidden calculations. They spoke of responsibility while examining furniture. They offered sympathy while asking questions about documents. Aurelia was 22 when she realized that grief did not protect anyone from ambition. Her father had left instructions regarding her future. There was a small inheritance meant for her security and a portion of the property that was to remain hers until marriage. But the papers were controlled by others, and others had reasons to delay. Lady Euphemia Corisande, a distant relative who had become the strongest voice in the household after Edmund Vane's death, claimed she was protecting Aurelia. She said young women were easily confused by legal matters. She said men of business could not be trusted. She said Aurelia needed guidance. But every decision somehow resulted in less independence for Aurelia. The servants were reduced, the household expenses were questioned, the letters Aurelia received became fewer. The letters she attempted to send somehow never reached their destinations, The first time Aurelia understood she was being trapped was not during an argument. It was on a cold evening beside the fireplace, when she noticed a familiar seal broken on a letter that had been returned to the household. The letter had been addressed to her father's old solicitor. The seal was not hers. The paper had already been opened. When she asked about it, Lady Euphemia simply smiled. "Aurelia, dear, there are matters beyond your understanding." Those words stayed with her, not because they were insulting, because they revealed the truth. Lady Euphemia did not see her as a daughter of the house. She saw her as someone who needed to be managed. The reason became clearer over the following months. Ashcombe Hall entered their conversations more often. The Duke of Ashcombe, Lord Julian Ashcombe, was a man with an ancient title and a vast estate. His family name carried influence throughout the county. His lands stretched beyond what most people could imagine. But the Duke was also known for being difficult. He was private, serious, unwilling to participate in the endless games of society. Lady Euphemia believed marriage between Aurelia and the Duke would solve several problems at once. If Aurelia became Duchess of Ashcombe, Lady Euphemia could claim she had arranged the match. She could gain influence over the new Duchess. She could place herself near power. And if Aurelia remained grateful for being rescued from obscurity, she would never question what had happened to her inheritance. But Lady Euphemia had misunderstood one important thing. Aurelia was quiet. She was not weak. The winter before the Ashcombe gathering, Aurelia began making notes. Small notes, careful notes. She copied figures from household accounts when no one watched. She remembered dates. She compared payments with receipts. She noticed that certain sums disappeared, not large enough to attract immediate attention, only small amounts. The kind of amounts people believed no one would bother investigating. A few pounds here, a few pounds there. But over years, small amounts became something much larger. She needed proof, not suspicion, not anger. Proof. The only person who seemed to understand her situation was Mrs. Eleanor Whitby, an older housekeeper who had served the Vane family for decades. Mrs. Whitby never spoke against Lady Euphemia openly. A servant who challenged the wrong person could lose everything. But one evening, while placing a tray beside Aurelia's desk, she paused. There was a strange silence between them. Then Mrs. Whitby quietly said that some papers were never destroyed, even when people wished they were. Aurelia looked at her. The older woman immediately returned to her duties. That was all. But it was enough. A clue hidden inside a simple sentence. Later that night, Aurelia searched through the old storage room connected to her father's study. The room smelled of dust, leather, and old wood. Behind a shelf of unused books, she found a small locked box. The key was missing, but carved into the side of the box were her father's initials. E.V. Her heart beat faster. She knew her father would never hide ordinary papers. She needed to know what was inside. The next morning, before she could find a way to open it, Lady Euphemia announced that Aurelia would attend a gathering at Ashcombe Hall. The invitation was presented not as a choice, as an obligation. "You should be thankful," Lady Euphemia said. "The Duke requires a wife. Your position requires improvement. This arrangement benefits everyone, except Aurelia." She understood then. The ballroom humiliation was not an accident. It was the final move of a plan. If she accepted the marriage after being mocked, Lady Euphemia could claim she had given Aurelia a chance. If she refused, society would say she had rejected one of the greatest opportunities available to a woman without fortune. Either way, Aurelia would lose. At least, that was what Lady Euphemia believed. The carriage journey to Ashcombe Hall was filled with rain against the windows and silence inside the cabin. Outside, the countryside disappeared beneath grey skies. Inside, Aurelia held herself still. It was the first time in her life that she had entered a world where every person was measuring her value, not by her kindness, not by her intelligence, by what they believed they could gain from her. When she stepped into the ballroom and heard the laughter, something inside her changed. It was not courage born from anger. It was something quieter. For the first time in her life, she had to discover the truth. And when the Duke of Ashcombe took her hand before everyone who had mocked her, she saw something unexpected in his expression. Not pity, not amusement, concern, because the Duke knew something she did not. The invitation that brought Aurelia to Ashcombe Hall had never been written as a joke by everyone. Someone else had placed her name on that paper for a reason, and that reason was hidden somewhere inside the walls of Ashcombe Hall. The reason was hidden somewhere inside the walls of Ashcombe Hall. Aurelia did not yet know whether that reason would save her or destroy her. The morning after the gathering, she awoke in a guest chamber overlooking the eastern gardens of Ashcombe Hall. It was a room prepared for visitors of importance, with thick curtains, carved furniture, and a small fire burning quietly against the winter cold. Yet despite the comfort surrounding her, she felt more like a prisoner than a guest. The previous evening had changed everything. Before entering that ballroom, she had been a woman whose future was controlled by others. After the Duke had taken her hand and publicly accepted her, she had become someone every person in the room wanted to understand. Some wanted to admire her. Some wanted to mock her further. Some wanted to discover whether she truly had influence over the Duke of Ashcombe. Aurelia knew better. She had not gained power. She had only stepped onto a larger battlefield. When she dressed that morning, she chose a simple grey gown rather than one of the elaborate dresses prepared for her. It was not a rejection of elegance. It was a reminder. She would not allow silk and pearls to become another chain around her. As she entered the breakfast room, she found the Duke already seated beside the window. Lord Julian Ashcombe was younger than she had expected. The stories about him had painted a cold and distant man who cared only for his estate and his title. But sitting across from him, Aurelia noticed something different. He looked tired, not weak, not uncertain, simply tired of pretending everything around him was acceptable. The breakfast table held a quiet arrangement of silver dishes, warm bread, preserved fruits, and carefully prepared portions of food that reflected the wealth of Ashcombe Hall. But neither of them reached for anything immediately. Finally, the Duke placed his cup down. "Miss Vane," he said, "I owe you an explanation." Aurelia watched him carefully. "Not an apology, an explanation. There was a difference." "I imagine many explanations have already been offered on my behalf," she replied. A faint expression crossed his face, almost amusement. "You have a sharper understanding of society than most people who have spent their entire lives inside it." Aurelia looked away toward the frost-covered gardens. "I have spent my entire life watching people say one thing while arranging another." The Duke was silent. Then he reached into a drawer beside the table and removed a folded document. Aurelia recognized the paper immediately. Not the handwriting, the seal. Her father's seal. Her breath stopped. "Where did you get that?" The Duke did not answer at once. Because he understood the importance of the moment. Not because he wanted to create mystery, because he knew some truths were heavy. "This was delivered to my solicitor several weeks ago," he said. "It was found among papers belonging to a former employee of your father." Aurelia did not touch the document. A former employee? A man named Thomas Hale. The name struck something inside her. She remembered hearing it years earlier. Her father had trusted Thomas Hale. He had managed certain agricultural accounts before leaving the Vane estate unexpectedly. Lady Euphemia had said he was dishonest. Aurelia had never believed that. The Duke continued. "He left behind a statement claiming that certain financial records connected to your father's estate had been altered." Aurelia looked at him. "Why show me this?" "Because," the Duke replied, "I believe someone wanted this document hidden." The room became very still. Outside, rain began falling against the glass. Aurelia studied his expression. She searched for arrogance, for calculation, for the hidden motive she had learned to expect from wealthy men. She found none. But she also refused to trust too quickly. "And why should I believe you are different from the others?" The Duke accepted the question without offense. "You should not believe me yet." That answer surprised her. Most men of his position expected obedience, not suspicion. He continued, "But I intend to prove it." For the first time in her life, Aurelia felt someone powerful offering her something rare, not rescue. Respect. It was a dangerous feeling, because hope could make a person careless, and Aurelia could not afford to be careless. Later that afternoon, she walked through the corridors of Ashcombe Hall with Mrs. Whitby, who had been allowed to accompany her from the Vane household. The old housekeeper moved slowly, but her eyes missed nothing. "This place remembers everything," Mrs. Whitby whispered. Aurelia looked at the long hallway, the portraits watching from dark frames, the locked doors leading into rooms where generations of Ashcombes had made decisions. "Houses like this do not forget," she said. "No," Mrs. Whitby answered. "They only wait for someone brave enough to ask the right questions." They reached the library. The door was locked. The Duke had told Aurelia earlier that his family records were kept there. But he had not given her permission to enter. She did not force it. Instead, she noticed something else, a small mark near the lock. A scratch, recent. Someone had attempted to open it. Mrs. Whitby noticed it too. Neither woman spoke. They did not need to. Aurelia had spent months learning that secrets rarely announced themselves. They appeared in small details. A broken seal, a missing letter, a door opened too carefully. That evening, while returning to her chamber, Aurelia heard voices beyond a half-open doorway. She stopped, only for a moment. The voice belonged to Lady Euphemia. "I warned you this arrangement was unnecessary," she said. "The girl should have been grateful for humiliation. Instead, the Duke has made her interesting." A man answered. Aurelia did not recognize him. "If she discovers the accounts, everything changes." Lady Euphemia gave a quiet laugh. "She will not. She has spent her entire life believing honesty protects people." The unknown man lowered his voice. "And if the Duke continues investigating," there was a pause. Then Lady Euphemia spoke again. "Then we remind him that even powerful men have reputations to protect." Aurelia stepped away before they could hear her. Her hands were cold. Not from the winter air, from understanding. The humiliation in the ballroom had not been the plan. It had been a warning. Someone had expected her to disappear quietly after being embarrassed. Someone had not expected the Duke of Ashcombe to stand beside her. For the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Hall, Aurelia understood that her position had changed. She was no longer fighting only for herself. She was standing between a powerful family and a secret they had protected for years. The following morning, the Duke announced that he would host a private meeting with several relatives regarding the future of the Ashcombe estate. Lady Euphemia smiled when she heard the news. She believed she had gained another opportunity, but Aurelia noticed something else. A servant who had been silent during breakfast suddenly avoided looking toward Lady Euphemia. A young maid carrying a tray paused when Aurelia entered the room. And before walking away, the maid quietly placed a folded piece of paper beside Aurelia's hand. No name, no explanation, only 3 words written inside. "Ask about Thomas." Aurelia looked up immediately. The maid was already gone. And somewhere within Ashcombe Hall, someone who had been silent for years had finally decided that the truth was worth the risk. The truth was worth the risk. Aurelia carried those words with her through the rest of the day. She did not immediately search for the maid. She did not rush to the Duke and repeat what she had heard. That was what Lady Euphemia would expect. A frightened young woman who had finally discovered danger would run toward the nearest person with authority and reveal everything. But Aurelia had learned something during the months when her own household had slowly turned against her. Information was fragile. Once spoken aloud, it could be taken, twisted, and used against the person who revealed it. So she folded the small paper carefully and placed it inside the hidden pocket of her gown. Then she continued through the day, as if nothing had changed. It was the first time in her life that she understood the value of appearing ordinary while thinking carefully. The Duke noticed. During the afternoon meeting with his estate manager, he saw Aurelia sitting quietly beside the fireplace, listening more than speaking. She did not interrupt. She did not attempt to impress anyone. She simply watched. When the meeting ended, Lord Julian Ashcombe remained behind. "You heard something," he said. Aurelia looked at him. "You are certain?" The Duke walked toward the desk where several estate documents had been arranged. "I am certain that you have the expression of someone who has discovered a door, but does not yet know whether opening it is wise." Aurelia almost smiled. "You observe people too closely. It is necessary in my position. And has it helped you?" The Duke was silent. That answer told her enough. No, it had not always helped him. Aurelia removed the folded paper from her pocket and placed it on the desk. He read the words, "Ask about Thomas." His expression changed, only slightly. But Aurelia noticed. Who was he? The Duke looked toward the window. Thomas Hale was my father's steward. Aurelia waited. She knew there was more. He was dismissed shortly after my father died. For dishonesty? The Duke nodded once. That was the official explanation. But you do not believe it. No. The simplicity of his answer surprised her. Why? Because I later discovered that several records he maintained disappeared. Aurelia felt a coldness settle over her. Not fear. Recognition. The same pattern. Missing letters. Altered accounts. People removed before they could speak. Someone had not simply stolen money. Someone had removed every person who could prove it. The Duke opened a drawer and removed a small ledger. This was found among my father's personal effects. Aurelia examined the cover. There was no title, no identifying mark, only a faint stain along the edge. She opened it carefully. Inside were columns of numbers. Payments, dates, names. She scanned the pages. Then she stopped. One name appeared repeatedly. Euphemia Corisande. The room seemed to become smaller. The Duke did not look surprised. He had already suspected. Aurelia closed the ledger. You knew. I suspected. There is a difference. Aurelia looked at him. A difference that matters. Yes, because suspicion without proof destroys innocent people. She lowered her eyes. That was a lesson she understood. For months, Lady Euphemia had used society's willingness to believe the worst. A woman's reputation could be ruined by a whisper. A marriage could be controlled by a rumor. A person could lose everything before anyone asked for evidence. That evening, another change occurred. Lady Euphemia requested a private conversation. Aurelia almost refused, but she accepted, not because she trusted her, because she wanted to see what Lady Euphemia would do when she believed she still held control. They met in the smaller drawing room. The fire burned brightly. The room was warm, but Aurelia felt the same cold she had felt standing in the ballroom. Lady Euphemia sat gracefully, holding a cup of tea. She looked like a woman offering kindness. That was perhaps what made her dangerous. You have settled in rather quickly, Lady Euphemia said. Aurelia remained standing. I have been a guest for 2 days, and already the Duke consults you. Aurelia did not answer. Lady Euphemia smiled. Do not misunderstand your position. There is a great difference between being protected and being powerful. Aurelia looked directly at her. I have never confused the two. The older woman's smile disappeared for a moment, then returned. You are more stubborn than your father. That was not a compliment. Aurelia noticed. You knew my father well, better than you imagine. Then perhaps you can explain why his records were changed after his death. The silence that followed was immediate. Not dramatic, not loud, just complete. The kind of silence that revealed more than words. Lady Euphemia placed her cup down. Be careful, Aurelia. A young woman who accuses people above her position rarely receives sympathy. Aurelia felt the old instinct to lower her voice, to apologize, to make herself smaller. But that instinct belonged to the woman she had been before Ashcombe Hall, before the ballroom, before she realized silence could be chosen rather than forced. I am not accusing anyone, she said. I am asking questions, and questions can be dangerous, only to those who fear the answers. For the first time, Lady Euphemia looked at her differently, not as an inconvenience, not as a poor relation, as a threat. The conversation ended soon after, but when Aurelia returned to her chamber, she found something waiting on her desk. A small envelope, no seal, no name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a list of dates, and beneath them, one sentence. Thomas Hale did not leave Ashcombe willingly. Aurelia stared at the words. The mystery had become something larger than inheritance, larger than marriage. Someone had been removed from Ashcombe Hall because he knew the truth. And if Thomas Hale was still alive, then he was the one person who could connect every missing piece. But finding him would not be easy. Because the next morning, before Aurelia could ask anyone about Thomas Hale, the Duke received a letter from London. A letter that changed the direction of the investigation completely. Someone had discovered where Thomas Hale had gone, and someone else was already trying to make sure he was never found. The letter from London arrived before breakfast. It was not addressed to Aurelia. It was not addressed to Lady Euphemia. It was delivered directly into the hands of the Duke of Ashcombe by a messenger whose coat was soaked from the winter rain. Aurelia watched from across the room as Julian Ashcombe broke the seal. For the first time since she had met him, she saw his composure disappear. Not completely. A man raised among powerful families learned early how to hide emotion, but his hand tightened around the paper, and that small movement told her everything. Something had happened. The Duke dismissed the servants before speaking. Thomas Hale has been located. Aurelia stood immediately. Alive? The Duke looked at her. Yes, but he was attacked 2 nights ago. The room went quiet, not because the news was unexpected, because it confirmed what both of them already feared. Someone was not merely hiding the past. Someone was protecting it. Where is he? Aurelia asked. The Duke folded the letter. A small village outside London. He was taken to a local inn after being found injured on the road. Aurelia felt her chest tighten. The first person who could prove what happened to her father had nearly been silenced. She looked toward the window. Rain moved down the glass in thin lines. For months, she had believed her struggle was about a stolen inheritance, a cruel relative, a household that had decided she was inconvenient. But now she understood something far more frightening. Her father's death, Thomas Hale's disappearance, and the altered records were not separate events. They were parts of the same design. The Duke noticed the change in her expression. You should not involve yourself further. Aurelia looked back at him. That is an unusual thing to say to someone whose family has been damaged by this. The Duke accepted the criticism. You are right. Then why say it? Because I have seen what powerful people do when they believe their interests are threatened. Aurelia studied him. And you think I should step away? I think you should have the choice. Those words affected her more than he realized. Choice. It was a simple word. But for most of her adult life, choices had belonged to other people. Lady Euphemia chose where she lived. Others chose which letters reached her. Others chose what society believed about her. For the first time, someone powerful had placed a decision in her hands instead of taking one away. She answered quietly, Then I choose to know the truth. The Duke did not argue. But before they could make arrangements to leave, another message arrived. This one was not from London. It came from inside Ashcombe Hall. The young maid who had given Aurelia the note stood nervously at the doorway. Her name was Clara. She was barely 20 and looked frightened by the attention she had attracted. Your Grace, Miss Vane, she said softly. I know something about Mr. Hale. The Duke immediately motioned for her to enter. Clara glanced toward the corridor before closing the door. I heard Lady Euphemia speaking with a gentleman last night. Aurelia remained still. The Duke asked, Who was the gentleman? I do not know his name, but he was not a guest. He knew the servants' passages. That detail mattered. A stranger could enter a ballroom. A stranger could attend a dinner. But someone who knew the hidden roots of Ashcombe Hall belonged to its history. What did they say? Aurelia asked. Clara swallowed. They spoke about the London letter. They said Mr. Hale had been found before he could tell the Duke everything. The Duke's expression hardened. Then Clara continued. The gentleman said there was still one problem. Aurelia waited. Clara looked at her. He said, The girl has already started asking questions. No one spoke. The fire continued burning. The sound of the flames seemed unusually loud. Aurelia understood then. She was no longer simply searching for answers. She had become one of the problems they wanted removed. Not because she was powerful, not because she had wealth, but because she refused to stop looking. The Duke stepped closer to Clara. You did well to tell us. The maid lowered her eyes. I almost did not. Why? Because people like me do not usually survive when we speak against people like them. Aurelia looked at the young woman. There was fear in Clara's face. But there was also something else. The same thing Aurelia had felt when she found her father's locked box. The moment when a person realizes that silence has already cost too much. Aurelia reached for Clara's hand. You have risked something for the truth. You will not stand alone. Clara looked surprised. It was perhaps the first time anyone in a grand house had spoken to her as an equal rather than as a servant. That evening, the investigation moved beyond Ashcombe Hall. The Duke arranged for a discreet journey to London. But before leaving, Aurelia returned once more to her father's old documents. She could not ignore the locked box. The box still remained unopened. The key was missing, yet now she knew where to look. Not in the places powerful people searched, in the places they ignored. The servants' quarters, the old storage rooms, the forgotten corners where ordinary people kept the memories of important families. With Mrs. Whitby's help, Aurelia searched through items that had once belonged to her father's household. Near an old wooden chest, hidden beneath folded linens, Mrs. Whitby found a small object wrapped in cloth, a key. The older woman stared at it. I wondered if I would ever see this again. Aurelia turned toward her. You knew? Mrs. Whitby hesitated. Your father trusted very few people. He told me that if anything happened to him, certain things must not be handed to those who asked for them first. Aurelia held the key tightly. Why did you not tell me before? Because I did not know who I could trust. The answer hurt, but Aurelia understood. Trust had become a luxury inside both Vane House and Ashcombe Hall. She returned to her chamber and opened the locked box. Inside were not jewels, not money, not documents that immediately revealed everything. There were only 3 items. A letter from her father, a small accounting book, and a list of names. Aurelia opened the letter first. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's words were calm, careful, but beneath them was a warning. He had known someone was trying to take control of his estate. He had known the danger was close. And he had written one sentence that made Aurelia's hands tremble. The person who betrays you will not be the one who hates you most, but the one who benefits from your trust. She read it again, then again. Because suddenly, she realized the greatest danger was not hidden in strangers. It was hidden among familiar faces. The accounting book contained records from years earlier. Payments, transfers, signatures, and one entry that connected everything. A payment made shortly after her father's death, signed by someone inside Ashcombe Hall. Aurelia stared at the name. She had expected to find an enemy. She had not expected to find someone who had been standing beside them all along. And when she showed the page to the Duke the next morning, even he looked genuinely shaken. Because the signature belonged to the one person neither of them had suspected. Lord Julian Ashcombe looked at the page for a long moment. He did not speak immediately. That silence told Aurelia more than any accusation could have. The signature at the bottom of the payment record was not Lady Euphemia's. It was not the unknown gentleman's. It belonged to the Duke of Ashcombe's own uncle, Lord Edmund Ashcombe, a man who had been dead for several years. A man whose reputation had remained untouched because everyone believed he had served the family faithfully until his final days. Aurelia watched Julian carefully. You knew him. The Duke lowered the paper. He raised me after my father's death. There was no anger in his voice. That was what made it painful. Anger would have been easier. Aurelia understood that feeling. To discover an enemy was simple. To discover that someone you respected had been part of the ruin was something far more difficult. He trusted me with this estate, Julian said quietly. And yet, someone used his name. The Duke nodded, which means the person responsible knew exactly how to hide. Aurelia looked back at the document. The payment had been made through a private account connected to Ashcombe Hall, but the purpose of the payment was not written. Only the amount, the date, and the signature. It was enough to raise questions, not enough to win. The old lesson returned to her. Suspicion was not proof. She folded the paper carefully. Then we need more. The Duke looked at her. You speak as though you are preparing for a trial. Perhaps I am. A small expression crossed his face. Not amusement. Respect. Because he realized Aurelia was no longer the woman who had entered his ballroom afraid of society's judgment. She was becoming someone who understood how to fight within that society. Before they could continue, a message arrived from London. Thomas Hale had regained consciousness, and he had asked for Aurelia Vane by name. The journey began before sunrise. The carriage moved through wet countryside roads, leaving Ashcombe Hall behind. For the first time, Aurelia saw the estate from a distance, the tall stone walls, the dark windows, the grand entrance where she had once been displayed as a joke. But now she understood something. The house had not defeated her. It had revealed itself. When they reached the village outside London, they found Thomas Hale staying at a modest inn near the Market Road. It was a far cry from the halls of Ashcombe. The rooms were small, the furniture was worn, the fire was not large enough to warm every corner. Yet there was honesty in the place. People worked, people struggled, people survived, without pretending to be something they were not. Aurelia noticed that immediately. The innkeeper led them upstairs. Thomas Hale lay in a small room, his shoulder wrapped, and his face pale from exhaustion. When he saw Aurelia, his eyes filled with regret. "Miss Vane." Aurelia stepped closer. "You knew my father." Thomas looked toward the window. "I did, and I failed him." The words were unexpected. Aurelia remained silent. The old steward continued. "Your father discovered that money was being removed from his estate. He knew the accounts had been changed. He asked me to investigate. Then why did you leave?" Thomas closed his eyes. "Because I was afraid." The answer was quiet, human, not heroic, not dramatic, just painful. "I found evidence, enough to prove someone inside both households was involved. But before I could show him everything, your father died." Aurelia felt the room grow colder. Was his death natural? Thomas looked at her. "I never found proof otherwise. But I found proof that someone wanted him weakened before he died." The Duke stepped forward. "What proof?" Thomas reached beneath the blanket and pulled out a small folded paper. "I hid this because I knew they would search my belongings." Aurelia accepted it. It was another list of payments, but this time, beside each payment was a note, names of servants, dates when letters disappeared, instructions about who should be removed from the household, and one final entry, a planned marriage arrangement. Aurelia stared. The date was before the Ashcombe gathering, before Lady Euphemia had publicly humiliated her. Thomas spoke softly. "They wanted you married. But not because they wanted your happiness. They believed a marriage would make it easier to control what remained of your inheritance." The room became silent. Not a peaceful silence, the kind that came when the truth finally stood in front of everyone. Aurelia had spent so long wondering why she had been chosen, why she had been pushed toward a duke, why her humiliation had been arranged so carefully. Now she understood. She had not been chosen because she was worthless. She had been chosen because she was valuable, and someone had believed they could use her value against her. The Duke looked at the documents. "We take these to my solicitor." Thomas nodded. "But before they can be presented, you need one more thing." Aurelia looked at him. "What?" "A witness. Someone who saw the original records before they were changed." Thomas hesitated. Someone still inside Ashcombe Hall. The answer struck them both. Someone who had remained silent, someone who had watched, someone who knew exactly what happened. And when Thomas finally spoke the name, Aurelia realized the final piece of the mystery had been near her from the beginning. She had been the one person in the room who had refused to look away. But Aurelia knew that a moment of truth was not the same as justice completed. The silence that followed the revelation in the ballroom was powerful, but silence alone could not repair what had been broken. For years, the Vane name had been weakened by whispers. For years, missing papers, altered accounts, and carefully arranged misunderstandings had allowed certain people to benefit, while others suffered. A single evening could expose the deception, but it could not erase the consequences. That was why Aurelia remained calm when the guests began leaving Ashcombe Hall that night. She did not celebrate. She did not seek the satisfaction of watching Arthur Ashcombe lose his composure. She simply stood beside the Duke and watched the room empty. The same room where she had once entered as someone others believed they could dismiss. The same room where people had laughed because they thought her humiliation belonged to her alone. Now those same people left quietly, carrying a different understanding of what they had witnessed. Not every person who apologized did so because they had changed. Some apologized because they feared being connected to the wrong side of a scandal. Aurelia understood that. She had learned enough about society to recognize the difference between regret and self-preservation. The following days brought a careful examination of the evidence. The Duke of Ashcombe did not allow anger to guide his decisions. Instead, he relied on documents, witnesses, and the proper channels of authority. His solicitor reviewed the financial records connected to both Ashcombe Hall and the Vane estate. Every payment was examined, every signature was compared. Every letter was placed beside the events it described. For the first time, the papers that had been ignored were treated as valuable. The truth had not been hidden because it did not exist. It had been hidden because certain people had the power to make others stop searching. Arthur Ashcombe attempted to leave London quietly before the matter became widely discussed among the upper circles. He believed distance could protect him. He believed a change of location could separate him from the consequences of his actions. But the world he had depended upon was changing. The same families who once welcomed him began keeping their distance. The same gentlemen who had praised his opinions became careful when speaking his name. No one wanted to be seen defending a man whose reputation had become uncertain. Arthur had spent years believing influence was something permanent. He discovered that influence built only on appearances could disappear as quickly as it was created. The consequences were not dramatic. There was no public spectacle of punishment, no grand declaration of revenge. Instead, the doors that had once opened for him began closing one by one. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations ended when he entered a room. People who had once admired his confidence began questioning his judgment. For a man who valued status above everything, losing the approval of society was the punishment he feared most. Lady Euphemia experienced her own fall. The woman who had once controlled the atmosphere of every room she entered found herself surrounded by uncomfortable silence. Servants no longer rushed to satisfy every demand. Relatives who had once accepted her opinions without question began asking for explanations. She had spent years believing that control was the same as security. Now she discovered that control built through fear disappeared when people no longer believed they had to obey. Aurelia did not take pleasure in it. That surprised even herself. There had been a time when she imagined seeing Lady Euphemia humbled would bring peace. But standing in the garden of Ashcombe Hall several weeks later, Aurelia realized something important. Watching someone fall did not heal every wound. Only moving forward could do that. The garden remained the one place in Ashcombe Hall where people could speak without the pressure of society watching. The winter frost had begun to retreat. Small signs of spring appeared beneath the cold earth. Aurelia stood near the stone pathway when Lady Euphemia approached. The older woman looked different, not powerless, not broken, but uncertain. Aurelia had never seen that expression on her face before. "You must be satisfied," Lady Euphemia said. Aurelia looked at her. "Satisfied?" "That everything has been revealed." Aurelia considered the question. She thought about the ballroom, the laughter, the whispers, the moment when she realized that many people had already decided who she was before hearing a single word from her. "No," she said quietly. Lady Euphemia looked surprised. "No?" Aurelia shook her head. "I am relieved that the truth was discovered. But satisfaction is not the same thing." The older woman looked away toward the house. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lady Euphemia said something Aurelia did not expect. "I thought I understood how the world worked." Aurelia remained silent. Lady Euphemia continued. "A woman without wealth had limited choices. A woman without protection had to find ways to survive." Her voice became quieter. "I believed if I controlled everything around me, I would never become powerless." Aurelia listened carefully because she understood something about that fear. The world that had harmed her had also created the desperation that shaped Lady Euphemia. But understanding the reason behind cruelty did not remove responsibility for causing it. "You were afraid of losing your position," Aurelia said. Lady Euphemia nodded. "Yes, but you chose to take mine." The words were simple. They carried more weight than anger. Lady Euphemia lowered her eyes. For a long moment, the woman who had always found an answer had none. Then she spoke. "I was wrong about you." Aurelia looked at her. The apology was not perfect. It did not erase the months when Aurelia had been isolated. It did not return the confidence she had lost while being told that her own judgment could not be trusted. But it was the first honest statement Lady Euphemia had given her, and Aurelia understood that sometimes the beginning of change was not a grand confession. Sometimes it was simply a person finally admitting they had caused harm. "I accept that you understand it now," Aurelia said. Lady Euphemia looked up. "But understanding does not undo what happened." "No, it does not." Aurelia nodded. Then the older woman walked away. There was no embrace, no sudden reunion, no pretending that the past had never existed. Some relationships could be repaired, others could only be left behind with dignity. Aurelia chose not to carry hatred with her. But she also chose not to return to the place where she had once been hurt. That was her first true act of freedom. The changes at Ashcombe Hall began quietly. The estate accounts were reorganized. The household records were made clear. The servants who had spent years unnoticed were finally listened to. Aurelia insisted that improvements were not acts of generosity, they were acts of responsibility. She remembered what it felt like when decisions were made about her life, without her voice being considered. She would not allow others to experience the same helplessness within her home. The servants noticed the difference first. Mrs. Whitby, who had carried secrets for years, found herself no longer needing to whisper. Clara, the young maid who had risked herself by bringing information forward, was given opportunities to improve her position within the household. She was still a servant, but she was no longer invisible. That difference mattered. Aurelia understood that dignity was not only something given through titles. It was something shown through daily choices. The Duke of Ashcombe also changed. Or perhaps Aurelia simply saw more clearly who he had always been. Society had expected him to behave like a powerful man, to protect the family name above all else, to avoid embarrassment, to preserve appearances. Instead, he had chosen truth, even when the truth damaged his own family. That choice was what made Aurelia trust him. Their marriage had begun under unusual circumstances. Many people believed the Duke had acted out of duty. They believed he had defended Aurelia because it was honorable. But those who knew them understood something different. He had not chosen her because he pitied her. He had chosen her because he respected her. And Aurelia had not remained because she needed protection. She remained because she had found someone who did not try to own her choices. One spring evening they walked together through the garden. The same garden where Aurelia had once faced Lady Euphemia. The same paths where she had learned that forgiveness and surrender were not the same thing. The air was warmer now. The cold season had passed. Aurelia looked toward Ashcombe Hall. "When I first arrived here," she said, "I thought this house belonged to people with power." The Duke looked at her. "And now?" She smiled slightly. "Now I think a house belongs to the people who protect what is inside it." Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I took your hand in that ballroom, everyone believed I was saving you." Aurelia looked at him, "But I was not." The Duke continued, "You were the one who saved this house from becoming everything it pretended not to be." Aurelia did not answer immediately, because she knew the truth of those words. She had not entered Ashcombe Hall intending to change anyone. She had simply refused to disappear. That refusal had revealed secrets. That refusal had forced powerful people to answer questions they had avoided. That refusal had given others the courage to speak. Years later, visitors to Ashcombe Hall would still hear stories about the unusual beginning of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe. They would speak of the woman who had been chosen as a joke bride. They would speak of the Duke who had taken the vows seriously. But the people who knew the full story understood that the marriage itself was not the greatest victory. The greatest victory was that Aurelia Vane had entered a world that tried to measure her worth, and had discovered that her worth had never belonged to them. On quiet winter evenings, when the fire burned warmly inside Ashcombe Hall, Aurelia sometimes remembered the first night she stood beneath the chandeliers. She remembered the cruel smiles. She remembered the laughter. She remembered the feeling of standing alone, while an entire room decided what she deserved. But she also remembered the moment everything changed. Not when the Duke defended her, not when the evidence was revealed, not when society finally admitted it had been wrong. The moment that mattered most was earlier. It was the moment she chose to search for the truth, even when everyone around her preferred silence. Because a person's dignity can be challenged by others, but it is restored by the courage to stand when standing feels impossible. If this story touched you, remember to like, subscribe, and support the channel for more stories of hidden truths, forgotten voices, and justice restored before those who once refused to listen. The greatest victory was not the moment society admitted it had been wrong. It was the moment Aurelia realized she no longer needed society's approval to know who she was. But Ashcombe Hall still carried the weight of its past. A house could change its rules, a family could change its habits, yet memories remained in the walls. For Aurelia, healing was not a single moment beneath the chandeliers. It was found in ordinary days. It was found in waking each morning without wondering which letter had been hidden, which conversation had been twisted, or which person was quietly deciding her future without her knowledge. The first months after the scandal were not easy. Some members of society accepted her. Others never did. There were still people who whispered that her rise had been unexpected. There were still those who believed a woman from a modest family could not truly belong among the highest circles of the aristocracy. But Aurelia no longer feared those opinions. She had learned that people often protected their own beliefs more fiercely than they protected the truth. And she had already survived the judgment of an entire ballroom. One afternoon, while reviewing the estate accounts with the steward, Aurelia discovered another problem. It was not a secret conspiracy, not another hidden betrayal. Something simpler, something that revealed how deeply old habits had settled into Ashcombe Hall. Several workers from the outer farms had received delayed payments. The amount was not large enough to attract attention from those living in grand rooms. But to the families depending on those wages, it mattered. Aurelia immediately asked for the records. The steward looked uncomfortable. "My lady, these matters have always been handled in this manner." Aurelia lifted her eyes from the papers. "That is not an explanation." The steward lowered his head. No, it was not. She understood then that changing a household was not only about removing dishonest people. Sometimes it meant changing the quiet traditions that allowed people to be overlooked. She requested that the payment system be reviewed. She asked the workers directly about their concerns. Some were surprised, others were suspicious. They had learned over generations that promises from wealthy families did not always become actions. One older farm worker named Henry Carter spoke honestly. "We have had many people ask what we need, Your Grace." Aurelia looked at him. "And what happened?" They listened. Then they forgot. The words stayed with her, because she knew exactly what that felt like. Being heard was not the same as being valued. So she made certain the changes were visible. The payments were corrected. The records were made clearer. The workers were informed of decisions that affected them. Small changes, but meaningful ones. Mrs. Whitby watched all of it quietly. One evening, as Aurelia reviewed documents in the library, the older woman entered carrying a tray of tea. "You are becoming like your father." Aurelia looked up. "Is that a compliment?" Mrs. Whitby smiled faintly. "It is a warning." Aurelia laughed softly. "A warning? Your father believed every problem could be solved if people simply treated each other fairly." She placed the tea beside the desk. "The world is not always fair." Aurelia looked at the old housekeeper. "No, it is not." "Then why continue trying?" Aurelia looked around the library, the same room where hidden documents had once waited behind locked doors, because someone has to. Mrs. Whitby smiled, and that was when Aurelia understood something. She had spent years searching for justice because she wanted to restore what had been taken from her. But now she was creating something beyond herself. She was making certain others did not have to fight the same battle alone. That realization changed her. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but deeply. For the first time in her life, she was not only surviving what happened to her, she was building what came after. The Duke noticed the change as well. One evening, after a long day of meetings, he found Aurelia still working in the library. The candles had burned low. The papers on the desk were carefully arranged. "You will exhaust yourself," he said. Aurelia looked up. "That sounds remarkably similar to something my father would have said." The Duke smiled slightly. Then perhaps he was correct. She closed the ledger. "You know, when I first came here, I thought becoming Duchess of Ashcombe would mean entering a world where everything was already decided." Julian sat across from her. "And now I think every title comes with a responsibility to question what came before." The Duke was silent, because he knew she was right. Titles had protected people like Arthur. Titles had allowed certain voices to be ignored. But titles could also be used differently. They could open doors. They could protect those without influence. They could give weight to truths that would otherwise be dismissed. That was the difference between power used for control and power used for responsibility. However, not everyone had accepted the changes at Ashcombe Hall. A few months later, a letter arrived from London. It was addressed to the Duke. But this time, the contents did not concern a hidden account or missing document. It concerned reputation. Several influential families had begun questioning the way Ashcombe Hall was being managed. They considered Aurelia's involvement unusual, too direct, too independent. One particularly influential family suggested that a duchess should concern herself with appearances rather than estate matters. When Julian read the letter, he expected Aurelia to be hurt. Instead, she simply folded it. "They are afraid." The Duke looked at her. "Of what?" "That things can change." She placed the letter beside the candle. "People who benefit from an old system rarely welcome a new one." The Duke smiled. "You sound less like someone who entered society unwillingly, and more like someone preparing to challenge it." Aurelia looked toward the window. Outside, the evening mist covered the gardens. "Perhaps." Then she paused. "But I do not want to challenge society simply to prove I can. I want to prove that kindness does not make a person weak, that fairness does not make a person foolish, that a woman can be respected without becoming cruel." Those words remained with the Duke, because they revealed the difference between Aurelia and the people who had harmed her. She had experienced injustice, but she had not allowed injustice to define her. Yet as Ashcombe Hall entered a new season, another problem quietly approached. A letter arrived from the Vane estate, not from Lady Euphemia, not from any relative connected to the old conflict, from a solicitor who had discovered one final piece of information hidden among Edmund Vane's remaining papers, a document that had been overlooked, a document dated before his death, and according to the message, it concerned something Aurelia had never known existed: a second property, a forgotten trust, and a decision her father had made because he feared that one day his daughter might need a way to stand completely on her own. A decision her father had made because he feared that one day his daughter might need a way to stand completely on her own. The letter remained on Aurelia's desk for several minutes before she reached for it again. She had expected many things from her father's hidden papers: warnings, financial records, evidence of betrayal. She had not expected a final act of protection. Julian stood nearby as she read the solicitor's message a second time. "Your father prepared this before his death," he said. Aurelia nodded. "But he never told me." The Duke looked at the letter. "Perhaps because he believed telling you would place you in greater danger." That answer unsettled her. For so long, she had thought her father's silence after his death was the greatest pain she had carried. Now she understood something more complicated. He had not been silent because he had forgotten her. He had been silent because he had been trying to protect her from a danger he could not fully remove. The solicitor requested that Aurelia travel to the Vane property to examine the documents personally. The journey was not far, but emotionally, it felt like returning to another life. The Vane estate had once been her entire world, the place where she had learned kindness, the place where she had lost security, the place where she had discovered that love and protection were not always enough against ambition. When the carriage arrived, Aurelia looked out at the familiar grounds. The fields appeared smaller than she remembered. The trees seemed lower. The house that had once felt enormous now appeared almost fragile, because she was no longer seeing it as the frightened young woman who had been left behind. She was seeing it as someone who had survived. Inside the old study, the solicitor waited with a collection of documents. He was an older gentleman with careful manners and a cautious expression. "Lady Aurelia," he said. Aurelia noticed the title immediately, not because she disliked it, because once people had used titles to decide her value. Now, she understood that a title was only meaningful through the actions of the person carrying it. The solicitor opened the documents. "Your father established a small trust connected to a separate property." Aurelia looked surprised. "Why?" The solicitor hesitated. "Because he believed a woman's security should not depend entirely on marriage." The words affected her deeply. Her father had understood the very weakness society had forced upon women, A woman could be wealthy and still powerless. A woman could have a title and still have no control over her own choices. The trust was not enormous. It would never rival the wealth of Ashcombe. But it represented something more important: independence. Aurelia read through the papers carefully. There was a small property near a village outside the city, a modest house, several acres of land, and an instruction written in her father's hand. The property was to remain hers alone, not controlled by a husband, not transferred through another person. Hers. Aurelia touched the paper gently. He knew. The solicitor looked at her. Your father believed that one day you might need a place where no one could tell you that you belonged there only because they allowed it. For a moment, Aurelia could not speak, because that had been the fear beneath everything. Not losing wealth, not losing status, losing the right to decide where she belonged. When they returned to Ashcombe Hall, Aurelia did not immediately announce the discovery. She kept the documents private, not because she was afraid, because she wanted to understand what she felt. The younger version of herself would have seen the trust as proof that she had always been valuable, but the woman she had become saw something different. Her father had not given her worth. He had recognized the worth she already possessed. That evening, she walked through the gardens with Julian. The first signs of summer had begun to appear. The cold months that had once defined her life were becoming memories. I found something today, she said. The Duke looked at her. Something good? Aurelia smiled faintly. Something important. She explained the trust. Julian listened without interruption. When she finished, he remained quiet. You should keep it. Aurelia looked at him. I thought you might say that. Why? Because some men would see it as unnecessary once I became Duchess of Ashcombe. The Duke looked serious. Then those men would not understand what it means. What does it mean? That the person I love should never have to stay beside me because she has nowhere else to go. The words surprised her, not because she doubted him, because she understood their importance. A marriage built on dependence could become another form of captivity. A marriage built on choice was something entirely different. She looked toward the house. For years, people had tried to decide her future: Lady Euphemia, Arthur Ashcombe, even society itself. But now every important decision belonged to her, and that freedom was the greatest inheritance her father had left. The discovery of the trust also changed how Aurelia viewed her past. She no longer saw herself only as the victim of a cruel arrangement. She saw herself as someone who had crossed a difficult road and learned from every part of it. The girl who had entered Ashcombe Hall trembling beneath the laughter of strangers would not recognize the woman standing in the garden. But Aurelia recognized her, because she had never disappeared. She had simply needed the chance to be heard. That summer, she made another decision. The small property left by her father would not remain unused. She wanted to create something there, not a symbol of wealth, not another grand estate, something practical, a place where women who had lost their security could learn skills and earn their own income. Julian supported the idea immediately. Some members of society criticized it. They said such work was unnecessary. They said women of status should concern themselves with appearances. Aurelia remembered those words. She had heard similar ones before. A woman should not question. A woman should not investigate. A woman should not decide. But every time someone told her what she could not do, she remembered the locked box hidden in her father's study. The truth had survived, because someone had refused to accept silence, and now she would do the same. The opening of the small establishment was not a grand event. There were no chandeliers, no ballroom, no audience waiting to judge. Only a small gathering of villagers, workers, and people who understood what a second chance meant. Mrs. Whitby attended. Clara attended. Even some servants from Ashcombe Hall came to see what Aurelia had created. As she stood outside the modest building, Aurelia felt something she had not felt in years. Not triumph, peace. Because she finally understood that justice was not only about exposing those who caused harm, it was also about creating something better afterward. But as the evening ended, a visitor arrived at the property, a gentleman carrying an old leather case. He introduced himself as the representative of a family connected to the Vane estate, and he carried one final document, A document that suggested Edmund Vane had not only feared betrayal, he had feared that the betrayal had roots far deeper than anyone had discovered. The gentleman placed the leather case on the wooden table inside the small office of the property. He introduced himself as Mr. Theodore Bell, a solicitor who had once worked alongside Edmund Vane's legal advisors. Aurelia immediately noticed something unusual. He did not carry himself like a man delivering an ordinary inheritance matter. He carried himself like someone who had spent years deciding whether speaking would save someone or destroy them. "Lady Aurelia," he said carefully, "I wish I had come sooner." Aurelia remained standing. "Why did you not?" The solicitor looked down at the case. "Because your father instructed me not to reveal these documents unless certain conditions were met." Julian, who had accompanied Aurelia, stepped forward. "What conditions?" Mr. Bell opened the case. Inside were several sealed envelopes, old account books, and a collection of letters tied together with faded ribbon. "Your father believed that revealing the truth too early would put you in greater danger." Aurelia felt a familiar ache. Danger. That word had followed her for years. She had once thought danger meant losing her home. Then she had learned it meant losing her reputation. Then her independence. Now she wondered how many more secrets her father had carried alone. Mr. Bell removed the first envelope. "This concerns the Vane estate." Aurelia accepted it. The paper was old, but the seal remained intact. Her father's seal. She broke it carefully. Inside was a letter written shortly before his death. The handwriting was weaker than she remembered, but it was still his. "My dearest Aurelia." Those 3 words alone nearly broke her composure. Because after everything that had happened, after all the years of fighting against people who had used his name, she finally had another message from him. He wrote that he feared someone within his circle had become too interested in controlling the Vane estate, not because the estate was the greatest fortune in the county, but because it represented something more valuable: independence. Aurelia read the sentence twice. Her father had understood. He had known that a woman without control over her own resources could be easily trapped, even if she had a respectable name, even if she lived among wealthy people. The letter continued. He had discovered that several families connected to the old estates were quietly purchasing influence over smaller properties, not through open force, through debt, through agreements that appeared reasonable, through carefully written contracts that few people fully understood. Julian looked at the documents. This was larger than Ashcombe. Aurelia nodded. The betrayal was not only about taking my inheritance, it was about controlling people who had fewer choices. Mr. Bell opened another ledger. This one contained names. Not only Arthur Ashcombe, not only Lady Euphemia, several other names appeared. Some belonged to minor landowners, some belonged to merchants. Some belonged to people who had provided financial assistance to struggling families and later claimed control over their property. Aurelia felt the weight of what she was seeing. Her personal suffering had been part of something wider. The world that had harmed her was not created by one cruel person. It had been built by many people who believed those with less power would never challenge them. Julian looked at her. "You do not have to continue." Aurelia looked surprised. "After everything?" The Duke met her eyes. "Because this is no longer only your fight." That was the difference. Before Ashcombe Hall, Aurelia had fought because no one else would. Now she had the freedom to choose, and she chose. We continue. The next document revealed something even more unexpected. A letter from Edmund Vane to Julian Ashcombe's father. Aurelia looked at the name. Ashcombe. Her father had been communicating with the previous Duke of Ashcombe before his death. "Why?" Mr. Bell answered. "Because your father believed Lord Ashcombe was one of the few people powerful enough to oppose what was happening." Julian took the letter. He read silently. His expression changed. "My father knew." Aurelia watched him. Knew what? That certain people were using noble families against each other. The previous Duke of Ashcombe had suspected that someone was deliberately creating conflicts between estates, keeping families suspicious, keeping smaller landowners dependent, keeping women without direct inheritance rights even more vulnerable. The letter ended with a sentence that made the room silent. "A house does not fall because one person pushes it. It falls because too many people decide not to repair the cracks." No one spoke for several moments. The truth was larger than revenge, larger than punishment. Because now Aurelia understood what her father had truly left her. Not only protection, not only property, a responsibility. The following weeks changed the direction of Ashcombe Hall. The documents were reviewed carefully. The Duke did not make accusations without proof. Aurelia insisted on the same principle that had saved her. Evidence first, judgment second. Several agreements connected to vulnerable families were examined. Some were found to have been unfair. Some were rewritten. Some were challenged through proper legal channels. It was slow work. There were no dramatic victories every day. No ballroom filled with shocked faces. Only papers, meetings, conversations, small corrections that slowly repaired damage created over years. Aurelia discovered that real justice was rarely as beautiful as the moment when a secret was revealed. Most of the time, justice was patient. It was careful. It required people willing to continue after the applause ended. One evening, she sat in the library with Julian. The fire burned softly. The same room that had once represented hidden secrets now represented something different, a place where truth could remain visible. "You have changed this house," Julian said. Aurelia smiled faintly. No, the house was already capable of changing. It only needed people willing to admit what was wrong. The Duke looked at her. "That is something your father would have said." Aurelia looked toward the shelves. "I think he spent his life believing people could become better if someone gave them the chance." "And do you believe that?" She thought carefully. "I believe some people do, and some people only change when they finally face consequences." Julian smiled. "That sounds less forgiving." Aurelia looked at him. "Forgiveness is not the same as allowing someone to hurt you again." The Duke nodded. "A lesson you learned earlier than most." She looked at the fire. "A lesson I was forced to learn." Then she corrected herself. "No. A lesson I chose to keep, because that was the difference. Her past had shaped her, but it no longer controlled her." That winter, Ashcombe Hall hosted another gathering. Not a spectacle, not a performance, a gathering to recognize the people who had helped restore the truth. The ballroom was the same, the chandeliers were the same, the polished floor was the same, but the meaning had changed. When Aurelia entered, no one laughed, no one whispered, no one wondered why she was there. She belonged. Not because she had married a duke, not because society had finally approved of her, because she had earned her place through courage, patience, and integrity. Mrs. Whitby stood among the servants. Clara stood nearby. Thomas Hale, now recovered, attended as an honored guest. The people who had once been invisible were now part of the story, and Aurelia realized that was perhaps the greatest change of all. The truth had not only restored her name, it had restored the voices of others who had been ignored. Later that evening, as the music faded and the guests began leaving, Aurelia stood near the entrance of the ballroom. She remembered the first time she had stood there, a young woman chosen because others believed she was the easiest person to sacrifice. Now she understood something they never had. They had mistaken gentleness for weakness. They had mistaken patience for surrender. They had mistaken silence for defeat. And they had been wrong, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has been watching everything. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the person who sees the truth most clearly. And sometimes the bride chosen as a joke becomes the person who teaches an entire household what honor truly means. A home is not protected by the walls around it, but by the honesty kept within them. If this story moved you, remember to like, subscribe, and support the channel for more stories of hidden truths, forgotten voices, and justice restored before those who once refused to listen.